I'm sure some of you have already seen this. It just came up in my recs. They've got millions of subs, so obviously they are fairly well known.
Made in partnership with CuriosityStream.
Tier Zoo?
Every game goes through a development process, and Outside is no exception. During the game's early access alpha stage, it was mostly just a chemistry simulator. There wasn't too much.
This might be new for a lot of you,
and you could only play as single-cell builds at the time.
Maybe not.
Once the devs finished work on the first multicellular classes, the game.
Yeah, I just saw this the other day. I liked it.
They released an open beta for the game, which received so much
like talking about the world
time that it became known as the Cambrian Explosion.
In terms of like, you know,
so
gaming
today we're going to talk
terms.
about the meta during Earth's beta, and also discuss the most important abilities and stats at that time.
Love these sprites.
So, during the Cambrian meta, the devs hadn't released the terrestrial expansion pack yet. So, at the time, gameplay took place entirely within the marine biome. There also wasn't much in the way of mobility, intelligence, or stealth yet.
Like all the
as
stats.
Those stats weren't considered very useful by the player base until more advanced techniques were discovered. This doesn't mean there wasn't a bunch of diverse builds to choose from though, not at all. The Cambrian meta was dominated by arthropod builds. Arthropods had two perks that gave them a huge early lead in the story of Earth's metagame.
Arthropods?
The first was an exoskeleton. Offensive strategies weren't
I
too
love the
advanced
music
at
and the
time,
editing.
So all you needed in order to shrug off most attacks was decent armor. The second thing is that arthropods were among the first builds to unlock more advanced eyes.
Whatever
Most
all
players had
these
simple,
animations are
light-sensitive
from too
eyes
are really
during
good.
the
I don't know
game.
where it's all
The
from, but
compound
other
eyes granted
documentaries, I
crucial
guess.
accuracy bonuses. The best in the game until camera-style eyes were unlocked later. One of the most popular arthropod builds at the time was the Trilobite. It didn't have anything too spectacular about it in terms of abilities, but it was very
I
easy to
really
play,
liked learning about
making
this
it a
period of
great
time
beginner
for some
pick
reason.
At a time where just about everyone was a
I
beginner
think
at
it's
the
because of
game.
Evo,
It had solid
because I played
defensive
Evo
stats
so much
because
as a
of its
kid.
thick carapace armor,
I know
making it
some of you
very
guys know what I'm
difficult to
talking
deal
about.
damage to. Players did eventually learn how to get past their defenses.
But I don't
though,
know. I guess this
and at
period of
that
time
point,
is just
Trilobites
like
dropped
that
in
looks so
viability.
alien to me.
I'd place them in low C tier. The meta during the Cambrian Explosion advanced so rapidly that the truly low tier builds weren't around long enough to be remembered, so they really aren't worth talking.
Yeah, Evo's great.
Next up on the tier list is Hallucigenia, one of the few builds that wasn't running a tough carapace.
Why is it called
shell as part of its build.
hallucigenia? Does it make you
Instead,
hallucinate?
Hallucigenia players opted for a different type of defense.
What's
spikes.
why is it called that?
Spikes are the perfect defense against tough, armored opponents, because focusing all of your force into a single point can often
Does
be
anyone
enough
know
to pierce armor,
the Latin
even when
explanation
your
for
character
this?
is relatively weak otherwise. This is why piercing-type weapons dominate the insect meta today. Slash and crush-type weapons would easily be thwarted by chitin armor, but piercing damage is super effective. Anyways, even though this is a great strategy, Hallucigenia wasn't really any sort of threat and could be easily ignored by other players due to its small size and low mobility, so it's only in high C tier. While this build did
Hallucigenia.
eventually fall out of the meta, a non-spiked version of it is still run by some loyal Velvet Worm mains today, and this build even has a projectile attack. In B tier we have one of my personal favorite ancient builds, Opabinia. Opabinia was one of the first grappler builds to find any significant success in the game, and it's no surprise why. The meta at the time was heavily defense-based, and grapplers are always perfectly suited to dealing damage to a blocking opponent. The key to its success was its trunk, an attribute seen surprisingly few times across all the different expansions that have come and gone. Opabinia's trunk gave it an excellent grab with extended range, making it perfect for grabbing smaller players and preventing their
That thing
escape
looks
in spite of their
fucking
heavy armor.
creepy.
It also had excellent perception skills because it spec'd into compound eyes, with 5 eyes giving it full 360-degree vision. With that said, its mobility wasn't stellar and it had little in terms of defense, so it had basically no options if a player from a higher weight class attacked it. Unfortunately, after they suffered heavy losses and started to fall out of the meta, Opabinia mains started to spec into heavier defenses to compensate, and just kept doubling down until they'd sacrificed size, power, and uniqueness in order to become some of the most resilient, yet useless low tiers in the whole game, tardigrades. So B tier is as high as Opabinia ever got. In A tier, we have the only mobility-based build that existed during the
Fucking
Cambrian,
got him.
Hycoichthyes. Hycoichthyes was the first fish the devs ever added to the game, and it offered a lot of advantages over its arthropod competitors. Instead of compound eyes, which could see in all directions, Hycoichthyes had the first camera-type eyes, which didn't have 360-degree vision, but in exchange were better at focusing, letting them see through camouflage and track targets more effectively. In addition to their eyes, their internal skeleton gave them much more flexibility than builds with an exoskeleton had,
Always a bigger
allowing them to
fish.
change directions faster to evade attacks. Hycoichthyes was extremely small, putting it barely outside the microscopic weight class. However, the potential of this build only improved from here. Fish have been a meta staple in literally every single expansion, and it all started here. While they weren't top tier yet, they gained top tier status pretty quickly after the game released. This build's potential could not be overestimated, especially considering that a future fish build eventually unlocked the legs attribute and was able to enter the terrestrial servers. But in the Cambrian, they were no match for the top tier, Anomalocaris. The Anomalocaris build was the first in the game's history.
Like, if you told me, if you asked me, like, is this a real animal, I would probably say no. It does not look real to me.
Just about any attack thrown at it because of its armor.
I love that there's still things like this that I can learn about that I've never heard of before.
If it couldn't crack their armor, it could use its
like that looks like it's from a fucking movie to me. I mean, I know it is, but
weak point for massive damage. Its only real threat was other Anomalocaris players, because they could hit hard enough to crack their armor.
It's so cool looking.
Anomalocaris also had the most advanced compound eyes of any build at the time, rivaling that of present-day dragonflies. This gave them an edge when other players finally started speccing into stealth abilities. Anomalocaris was such an oppressive force that it ended up getting banned in the game's very first balance patch,
so what
which
happened
opened
to
up
it?
several new niches and allowed fish, mollusks, and other arthropods to diversify their strategies. So yeah, that's what Earth's meta looked like.
Why did it go away?
The meta progressed quite rapidly after that, with the devs adding the terrestrial DLC and with various players unlocking crazy new OP abilities like flight. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss.
It was a
future
mass
episodes
extinction event.
discussing
What was the
broken
event
builds
though?
Vishan, Silurian, and Devonian DLC updates. By the way, the source footage for this video is from two amazing prehistory documentaries. I'm sure many of you are familiar with one of them, BBC's Walking with Monsters.
Yeah, this one's good.
The other is a new one called Leaps in Evolution, which details the evolution of sight, starting from the earliest life on Earth all the way through to today. It features some of the best CGI ancient arthropods.
Yeah,
ever
Curiosity
made, so
Stream
I
has
highly
some good shit
recommend
on
watching
it. I mean, all the like Curiosity Stream and probably Discovery Plus too. Like, I would imagine there's probably something interesting to watch like every minute of the day on either of those services if you like feel like heading up for it. But so does YouTube, honestly. Like YouTube has some really good shit, like PBS Eons and stuff. Those are always great videos. I love those. I love refrigerators. Oh, dude, this looks sick. I've never heard of.
If you want to spend a long time in this place, you may need to consider taking health precautions, such as having your wisdom teeth removed or getting an appendectomy in advance. There are absolutely no reptiles or amphibians here, and all land mammals are brought exclusively by humans. There's been no rain here for almost 2 million years. But
really?
at the same
There's been
time,
no rain in Antarctica?
80% of the world's freshwater reserves are stored here. Antarctica, the coldest and probably the most mysterious continent on the planet. Over the past century, humanity has studied its surface quite well, but we all know that what's most interesting is usually hidden deep beneath. When scientists decided to look under the ice cover of Antarctica, what they saw there surprised not only ordinary
what's
people
under
like me, but
under
also
there?
the researchers themselves. So what is hidden deep beneath?
It's just like if you had an emergency with your wisdom teeth.
For a long time,
You'd be fucked, they're
scientists have
saying. Like,
believed
you have to have that
under
taken care of
the
before you go
immense
there.
thickness of ice, there's nothing particularly interesting. At most, maybe some small, scattered pockets of subglacial groundwater. However, the expectations that researchers had in the 90s have been exceeded. As it turns out, under the ice of Antarctica, there's a whole lake, and it's also
That's
quite
why they were
large,
removing
about
people's appendixes so they don't have like an
5,800
burst
square
appendix
miles,
when they get there.
15,000
Just like the chance of you having a
kilometers,
burst
which is about
appendix, you'd be
1.5
fucked. You'd die.
times the size
Because there'd
of
be
the
no way to
island of
perform that
Cerberus. The
procedure
depth of
there,
the
unless like the
reservoir
doctors were there.
4,000
But they aren't
feet
gonna have
over
a surgeon on
1,200
hand to
meters.
perform
This is
a
only 1,450
appendectory.
feet or
Appendectory?
442
What do you
meters
say?
less than in the deepest lake on the planet.
So that's, I guess that's the
Since
reason.
This reservoir was discovered near the Russian polar station Vostok. The lake was also called Vostok. This giant pond is hidden under a huge layer of ice with a thickness of 11,886 feet
I
or
didn't realize that.
3,623 meters. For this reason, the
I mean, I've heard
researchers
of
did not
this
expect
lake
to
before,
find
but
even the smallest signs of life in such harsh conditions. After all, the temperature near the lake reaches minus 128.2 degrees Fahrenheit. That's minus 89 Celsius. The The ice pressure exceeds the pressure of the icy crust of the moons of Jupiter, and sunlight never breaks through to the surface of the lake. In addition, the concentration of nitrogen and oxygen is 50 times higher than in ordinary freshwater lakes. Few organisms living on planet Earth can survive in such an adverse environment.
What if it was just like one
However,
giant
scientists
monster?
Still managed to find life in such extreme conditions. At the same time, it was completely unlike anything we had ever seen before. Researchers have discovered a new type of bacteria, which was given the name W123-10.
A new type of
The DNA of
bacteria.
this organism is only 86% identical to other living things on planet Earth. The reason is that the lake was isolated from the rest of the world for several million years. So the bacteria found there developed separately from all living organisms on our planet. Researchers later discovered that there were traces of about 3,500 species of living organisms in the lake. This number is disputed by some scientists, but the very fact of the existence of different forms of life has led researchers to a very important hypothesis. Since there are probably such lakes under the ice of Mars and the satellite of Jupiter, Europa, it's quite possible that life could also exist in those places. By the way, Vostok is far from the only subglacial lake. Willans and Ellsworth are two other large lakes in Antarctica. According to John Priscu, a professor of polar ecology from the University of Montana, the total number of ice lakes might be as many as 400. However, not all cavities under the ice of Antarctica are filled with water. One of these places is located under the glaciers of Marie Birdland. This is the Bentley Depression, which is the deepest continental point on the planet that is not filled with liquid water, about 8,215 feet, or 2,540 meters below sea level. Similar discoveries were made with the help of space sensors, which scanned the relief of Antarctica in both directions. As it turned out, the ice is distributed very
Yeah, what about like the
unevenly. The
neutrinos
ice of eastern Antarctica is slightly thicker.
in the ice? Isn't that one way they used of like measuring like how long the ice has been there for?
In the western part of the continent, the ice thickens to between 12
Like, what is a neutrino? Like a
22
particle that
miles, or
is
19
from
and 35 kilometers.
exposure to the
Such
sun. I don't know.
heterogeneity is due to the
Fuck it's
fact
called.
that under the ice of eastern Antarctica, a whole cemetery is hiding, consisting of the remains of the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana. Scientists call these remains cratons, which are the
What?
stable rocky cores of the continents that survived hundreds of millions of years of destructive tectonic activity of the Earth. There are at least 3 such cratons in East Antarctica. One of them is very similar to the rocks of Australia, the second to India, and the
shit.
third to the seabed. Perhaps these fragments came together a billion years ago when the supercontinent Rodinia formed, or maybe 500 million years ago with the advent of Gondwana. In any case,
Yeah,
cratons were
supercontinents
part
are
of the
fucking
continents that
creepy.
formed after the collapse
Think
of
about
Gondwana
the idea of all these
160
continents moving around like
million
that.
years ago.
What's even creepier is like the
Scientists
oceans are
didn't
different
limit their
names and
research
stuff.
to
It literally is like a
observations
different
from outer
world.
space
I love the
and
idea of
decided
that.
to drill a hole in order to study
It's like
the secrets
a
of
fantasy
Antarctica
fucking
more closely.
idea
The
almost.
research team used a special 2-foot, about 60 centimeter wide drill with hot water. Using this tool, after 63 hours of continuous operation, scientists were able to drill a hole with a depth of 7,060 feet. That's about 2,152 meters. Then the researchers measured
fun.
the water pressure and
That's what
the ice
Civilization reminds me of, like,
temperature,
playing
as
that
well as
sometimes
the
in, like, Giant
degrees of
Continent or
its
something.
deformation. Thanks to this, scientists hope to determine when the last time was that the ice sheet of Antarctica disappeared and when this might happen again. Also, the scientists plan to drill a few more holes. However, holes also appear in Antarctica that are not man-made. A few years ago, the
Holes.
whole world was alarmed by a huge hole of about 3,700 square miles, or 9,583 square kilometers in size. This is almost twice the size of the state of Rhode Island. Scientists have not seen such giant holes since the 1970s, so they could not immediately identify the cause of this hole that researchers called
Ah, shit, I just forgot.
wormwood.
I just remembered I forgot to
An
tweet
answer was
tonight.
soon found. It was caused by a cyclone. In September 2017, streams of warm and cold air collided at the South Pole, resulting in the formation of swirling winds reaching a speed of 72 miles or 117 kilometers per hour. Such powerful turbulence created huge waves of up to 52 feet or 16 meters high, which in turn pushed out large chunks of ice and thereby formed a huge hole. In addition, strong winds brought warm water to the cold Lazarev Sea, in which there are ice massifs. As a result, the ice began to melt, which also contributed to the emergence of a hole. Soon, it will grow to 37,000 square miles. That's about 95,829 square kilometers, and will then be about the size of Ireland. Wow. Torgay Martin, a meteorologist and climate modeler at the Helmholtz Center for Ocean Research in Kiel, Germany, believes that the number of cyclones that trigger these holes will only increase in the future. At the same time, given climate change, refreezing of holes will be much slower, so the ice melt in Antarctica will accelerate. However, Diana Francis, a specialist in atmospheric climate, believes that we shouldn't be afraid of this.
Vinny Cross with Elon Musk, that's a new one.
Promotes better circulation between the ocean and the atmosphere. And for Antarctic animals such as penguins or seals, this opens up new food sources.
And those
but at
seals
the
are
same
pissed.
time, Francis does not deny that the large size of holes affects the circulation of the ocean, and therefore could lead to global climate change. So scientists will continue to observe from space to try to be able to control the state of this ice continent. One of these observations occurred in 2019, and it seems to have inspired some hope. Researchers have noticed a mountain-like geological structure that separates the western and eastern parts of Antarctica. This line protects the largest glacier in Antarctica, the Ross Glacier, from the entry of warm water, and prevents large chunks of ice from spreading into the ocean. If not for this dividing line, the rate of entry of Antarctic subglacial groundwater into the ocean would increase by 20%, which could lead to an increase in global sea level by 38 feet or 11.6 meters. But this does not necessarily mean that we're completely safe. After all, next to the giant glacier, there's also another hole, which causes intense melting of the glacier in the summer months. Therefore, it seems quite possible.
Be cool to see
that
that someday in your own eyes.
Antarctica
Like that.
is only a matter of time. Despite the fact that Antarctica is so far from most of us, our future completely
Giant
depends
glacier.
on this continent. This is 80% of the world's fresh water.
Alien world
reserves,
might
and
be
if they
hiding
go into
inside
the
Earth.
ocean, even cities that are the farthest
Well, I
from
have to watch that
Antarctica
video now.
will sink underwater. If you want a future video on this subject, let me know in the comments.
What do you mean hiding inside the Earth? Literally?
A planet called Theia,
What?
covered in seas and rivers, full of exotic gardens and wondrous creatures, flies out of its orbit. Dun 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 dun, and travels in the direction of our solar system.
The fuck is this?
Hitting everything in its path, Theia makes Venus rotate in the other direction, breaks off a piece
The
of
fuck
the
is
Earth,
going on here?
and apparently, by the law of bartender's tricks, shares some water with it, splashing a little on the Martian.
Why does this guy
Then
sound like he's the
grabs
narrator
at
from like
Jupiter
world's
so
most
that it
extreme car
starts
chases?
spinning
He's gonna be like,
faster. This causes
then you
Theia to
sneeze so
crumble
hard
into
that your
small
balls
pieces,
explode.
so
Like that, he
fragments
said that or
reach
something. You know what I mean?
and form its rings together with cosmic dust.
You know what
The
I'm talking about.
remnants become moons of Uranus, and after this game
I like
of
the way he said
cosmic
that.
billiards, the universe makes every effort to stop us knowing about Theia. After all, it just wants to forget about it, like a bad dream. Dum 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 dum.
Andy Richter.
Dum 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 dum. No, this isn't a new Marvel movie plot. It's quite possible that this is what the hypothesis for the creation of the solar system will look like from the point of view of scientists who love Greek mythology just as much as they love getting research money from investors.
What is happening
Now,
here?
they're closing off any gaps when it comes to so-called Theia. In March 2021,
Tell me what you're talking about.
Scientists announced that they had found fragments of the alien world in the Earth's
Okay.
mantle. In this video, we'll go through their logic in detail.
I guess I
and
kind of believe that.
annihilate
It could be
every
possible.
unfounded theory. But most
I believe that an
we'll
ancient,
find
some
out for sure. So,
fragment of another
where is
planet
the
could have crashed
evidence
into
for
Earth at some
Theia's
point.
existence?
That's what an asteroid is, isn't it?
The moon is our eternal companion, but how did it come about? And who's responsible for our tides, for howling wolves, and for sudden headaches?
Why
and
do they use so much
irritability?
fucking clips
The
from
scientists believe
fucking Marvel
we owe
movies?
that to Theia. The logic of the scientists looks like this. Since the moon exists, then there's Theia, which could have chipped and knocked the moon off the Earth with a strong blow. David Scott and
This channel's
James
called, like, The
Irwin
Riddle
went
or
to
something
the
like
moon
that?
to collect samples, and they hit the jackpot. On the 1st of August, 1971, the Apollo 15 astronauts found the Genesis
Yeah, I was
stone.
expecting,
When
like,
it was examined, it turned out that the oxygen
some crazy
isotopes
shit.
of the Earth and the moon were almost as identical as Logan Marshall Green and Tom Hardy. This
Wow.
could just confirm the hypothesis about Theia.
I know
It's
those
believed that the
guys.
moment
I don't
Theia
know
hit the
the guy on the
Earth,
left,
about
actually.
100 million times more energy was released than when the dinosaurs became extinct. Some of the outer layers of the Earth evaporated, and both celestial bodies melted, and part of the mantle was thrown into orbit around the Earth. This hypothesis explains why the moon has an unusual composition and has no metallic materials. The ejected material condensed into a single body, and under the
That still doesn't
influence of its
explain, like,
own
anything
gravity, took a spherical shape.
that was
And
implied
now
earlier.
DreamWorks has a unique opening screen. You're probably saying, every school child knows about the meteorite that fell on us, luckily ensuring that we don't have T-Rexes roaming our streets now. But why is it that no one has any idea about Theia's fascinating story? Because the evidence for its existence has been refuted. When the stones from the moon were checked over time using
Yeah, this
improved
video is
methods
so
of
all over the
analysis,
place.
it turned out that the isotopic composition of the deeper rocks of the moon was not similar to that of the Earth, and Theia returned
Yeah,
to
I've
the
heard that
club
before.
of fictional characters again, to Ultron and Vision. Sorry for the spoiler, in case
I don't
you
like
haven't
the
watched it
similes
yet.
to the
And
fucking
now to the
Marvel
actual
universe every
logical
5
answer.
seconds. It's
The
like
moon was
patronizing.
formed of debris, cosmic debris. The
I don't
Earth
need
and
you
the
to
moon
relate it to
formed
the Marvel
nearby and
universe.
together from the same dust ball. Therefore, the identity of the oxygen isotope ratio is easily explained. This theory is considered the closest to reality. Just debris and no Theia. Would you like to find out more about how the logic
the
of
Thanos
scientists works? First, let's figure out how water appeared on Earth. According
Yeah, I
to
can-
their
I can
version.
empathize,
No
but
need to thank me. Theia would
not a
reply
channel
to
I
you.
think
The
I would
Earth
watch a lot
is
of.
Unique. It's the only rocky planet with a lot of water, but it was created in the dry inner part of the solar system. How is it even possible then? Scientists' logic. Water was transferred to
I don't know,
the
I
Earth
saw
during a
WandaVision and I still have no
collision
idea what
with
the fuck he was
Theia,
talking
and
about.
Probably there was water on it originally. A logical counter question. So, if it really was like that, there was life on Theia. Am I really the only one whose hair stands on end in response to this fact? After all, I understand that creatures on some planet died due to a collision with ours. What did these inhabitants of Theia look like? What was their level of development? What was their last day?
Oh my god.
Well, it didn't, because here's the really logical answer.
That's what it would look
Water
like.
on Earth appeared as a result of debris. To be more precise, some very cool cosmic debris. Among the particles from which the Earth was created, there were originally rocks that were prone to forming water. Later, water could have appeared from volcanoes. During their eruption, water vapor in the atmosphere could have condensed and rained down, slowly filling the Earth with water. Just debris and no Theia. Still, The scientists would not give up and keep trying to find Thea no matter what it takes. A lot of money is needed for science projects, and the cooler your research story,
No, the
more
volcano
you
shot
get.
water out of
Therefore,
them.
it seems that sometimes scientists have to come up with a whole PR move for their project. For example, Thea is a Greek titaness. Astronomers are poor scriptwriters, but they understood the principle of the Marvel industry. The more mythology,
Oh my God.
mysticism, and action, the more their story will be liked by the audience, and accordingly, sponsors. For example, a mission with NASA's stereo probes launched in
Dude.
2000.
It's only halfway done. I can't watch the rest of this one. I'm good. Yeah, this channel's called a Riddle, apparently. Marvel. No more. All right, let's watch one more good video. One more good thing. I'm gonna chill. But I guess we could do bedtime stories. Yeah, but even lowest common denominator, you gotta be like, I would just watch a Marvel movie if I wanted to see all this stuff. Like, it already looks cool. It's about space. Doesn't have to have fucking action heroes and stuff. I think I watched a lot of the cool ones I wanted to watch. Yeah. The Michigan Dogman. Belfast crossover. Man, I want to watch something like scary. Really good ones. Some of these are weirder than others. Carter House Guest is pretty good. I think we watched that one. I don't remember the names of these that well. Brigands was cool, I think. Uniondale Hitch. Belfast crossover, the one that's just like. Oh, you know what? Did we ever watch the Kentucky Goblin? I kind of want to watch that one, actually. This is one of my favorite ones. I don't know if we watched this one. Where are you, Goblin? Did we watch the Kentucky Goblin? They made like a whole show about this one. There's so many of these fucking thumbnails, I've just lost it. I feel like this has been happening to me all day. I'm like looking through a fucking folder of pictures, and it's like I keep losing what I'm looking at. What does that mean? I'm losing my mind? Some kind. There it is.
Scream alerted Billy Ray.
Cream.
During the hot Kentucky summer of 1955, an entire family burst into a local police station, shouting in panic that their home had been attacked by aliens. The officer on duty reacted with amusement, but little did he know that what he was now dealing with would become one of the most prolific and well-documented
Well, there's an actual
cases
show
of
based on
extraterrestrial
this
visitation on
called
record.
Hellier. We tried watching it one time, but it's a little slow. I've fallen asleep to it a few times. What is that mystery? The tent mystery? What the fuck was that? I don't think I've seen that one.
For most, Kentucky is known for its beautiful, rolling green pastures and world-renowned bourbon. But for others, the bluegrass state is home to many myths and legends, and even some downright terrifying paranormal and supernatural events. Perhaps one of the oldest is the hillbilly beast, a Bigfoot-like entity which is said to stalk various stretches of woodland. Then there is the Pope Lick creature, otherwise known as the Fisherville Goatman, which haunts a local railway bridge and is often heard mimicking a child's voice, calling out in distress to passers-by.
Pope Lick creature.
Those who venture forth to investigate are later found dead or disappear completely. One of
It
the
goes after
lesser-known
children and
legends
it's called the
speaks of
Pope
Little
Lick
White Men
creature.
of Kentucky, which is perhaps closely related to the case we're about to present, and which we will explore further in part 2. But for now, let us focus on the state's boldest claim to supernatural fame. A case known not just throughout the United States, but the entire world. On the night of the 21st of August 1955, a household situated in the rural stretches between the communities of Kelly and Hopkinsville in Christian County was apparently besieged by strange creatures, the likes of which the residents had never seen before, or for that matter, since. The event itself was witnessed by 11 people, 8 adults and 3 children, and would later involve up to 16 members of various law enforcements, as well as the military. For those immediately affected, the story is one of bewilderment, incredulity, and ultimately, unbridled terror, and is considered by many to be the definitive account of extraterrestrial visitation. More than 60 years later, not one word of these accounts has changed, and it would all play out as follows. Earlier that evening, Billy Ray Taylor, a young man in his early 20s, exited the farmhouse where he was staying with friends and made his way over to the well some 100 yards distant. Despite the heat, the dying light had brought with it a cool breeze, which stirred the leaves and branches of the trees surrounding the property. It was a welcome change from the stifling interior of the household. He and his wife June were visiting friends for the weekend on a much-needed break from work. The house itself belonged to Glennie Langford, who lived there with her 3 younger children. But it was Glennie's older sons from another marriage, Elmer Lucky Sutton and John Charlie J.C. Sutton, with whom he was most acquainted.
J.C. Sutton.
They were there too with their wives Vera and Aileen. Aileen's brother, O.P. Baker, had also joined the group for supper. In total, there had been 11 people, including himself, sitting inside the parlour, and unsurprisingly, the air had become heavy with heat and moisture. When Glennie declared that they had run out of water, Billy Ray had been first to volunteer in fetching some more. As he trudged towards the rear of the property, he stopped for a moment to admire his surroundings, regarding the lengthening shadows and encroaching gloom beyond the trees. The seclusion and privacy afforded by the encompassing woodland was not lost on him. Maybe one day, he thought, as he reached the well and threw in the pail, he would have the means to purchase his own patch of land just like it. There was a muffled splash as the bucket hit the water, and as Billy Ray worked to retrieve it, he turned his head skyward to look at the orange light of the setting sun. To his surprise, his gaze was drawn elsewhere. He suddenly caught sight of a round metallic object in the skies above the property, glinting in the last vestiges of the sun's rays. It looked to be descending at speed in an arc across the sky, with a multicolored
This is the beginning
tail
to
trailing
Creepshow.
behind it. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. There were no wings or discernible features, and it made no sound whatsoever. It disappeared behind some trees about half a mile distant, an action which was followed by a dull thud, and Billy Ray knew in that instant that whatever the object was, it had most certainly just crashed. Collecting the pail, he ran back to the farmhouse and declared to the others present that he had just seen a spaceship. There was a moment of silence before the room burst into a cacophony of laughter. The consensus amongst the group was that surely this was nothing more than one of those pranks that Billy Ray and Lucky sometimes played on one another. But Billy Ray was not laughing. In fact, he seemed genuinely agitated by what he had just witnessed, and as soon as his companions realised that he was not joking, they tried to reason that maybe he had seen a meteor or
Look what he's
shooting
reading,
star.
Jonathan Godzilla Boy,
Unwilling
59.
to let it go or pass it off so casually, Billy Ray insisted that Lucky accompany him to the well so that he could point out exactly where the spaceship had crashed and see if there was any smoke or other indication that something was out there. By now, darkness was well and truly creeping in. The two men spent 10 minutes surveying the skyline. It was hard to see anything in the twilight, but there were certainly no columns of smoke anywhere to be seen. Lucky didn't know what to make of his friend's story, but it was clear that something had shaken him. As they made their way back to the house, the sound of a snapping branch suddenly caught their attention. Somewhere out in the tree line, they spotted a dull glow, low to the ground but moving towards them. It wasn't bright enough to be a flashlight, possibly a lantern, but there was no definition to it. They watched as it moved closer, and only as it got to within 20 feet of them did they realise that something about this situation was terribly wrong.
Terribly.
They could not believe their eyes, but what they appeared to be looking at was a small humanoid figure with short, atrophied legs and long, thin arms. Its most striking feature, though, was its large saucer-like eyes, which glowed in the darkness. Either side of its head, they could see what looked like large pointed ears, and most disturbing of all was the fact that it seemed to be floating along the ground rather than walking, moving inexorably towards them. The two men yelled expletives, then ran into the house, slamming the door behind them. Glennie, who had been sitting in the parlour with the rest of their companions, rushed out into the hall and demanded to know what the commotion was about. "There is something in the woods near the house," Lucky replied. "Something strange. We best stay inside." Unsurprisingly, his mother did not believe a word of it, assuming that it was all part of a wider prank being perpetuated by him and Billy Ray. In any case, she did not want the children being scared at this hour, and so she sent the youngsters off to bed. Shortly afterwards, Lucky grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun along with his .22 hunting rifle, handing the latter to Billy Ray and instructing him to watch the back door whilst he watched the front.
Give my .22.
Glennie was just thinking to herself that this joke was all going a bit too far, when she suddenly spotted a small figure standing at the rear of the house. Her blood-curdling scream alerted Billy Ray, who immediately took aim with the .22 and fired. The bullet pierced the netting of the screen door and appeared to strike the strange creature, which tumbled backwards with a metallic rattling sound, and then moved off at speed into the trees, apparently uninjured.
I thought it makes a metallic sound.
Emboldened by the creature's retreat, Billy Ray stepped
Dude,
out
Billy
onto the
fucking
porch,
jacked.
aiming his rifle towards the
Fucking
woods
juiced
when all of a
up.
sudden, what can only be described as a spindly hand with long talons reached down from the porch roof and made a grab
This
for his hair.
story has to have
Bailey,
inspired
who had
M.
been
Night
standing
Shyamalan
behind
a little
him,
bit.
yanked him backwards into the house.
There's a couple things that happen in this
Lucky
story
then
that
stepped
remind me of
outside,
Sign
aiming
so
his
much.
weapon up towards where the hand had appeared. A shot rang out, and another of the creatures fell from the roof with that same metallic rattle, and then proceeded to hop into the woods, also seemingly uninjured. Once everyone was back inside,
Ash
JC
Williams.
collected his 20-gauge shotgun and joined the others. No one knew exactly who or what these creatures were, but it was quite evident that there was more than one of them, and they appeared to be completely impervious to bullets. Collecting their thoughts, the distraught men and women of the group began to exchange ideas about what they were dealing with. Glennie, who was deeply religious as well as superstitious, questioned whether they might be demons, sent by the devil himself. Lucky wondered if they were the cave goblins which folk in those parts sometimes talked about, whilst Billy Ray believed they had something to do with the object he had seen earlier that evening. Suddenly the air was pierced by a shrill scream, coming from the direction of the children's bedroom.
The aliens are taking the
The youngsters
kids.
had been instructed to
Taking
remain
them
where
out.
they were, but now they came running down the hall, saying that they had seen a strange face with large glowing eyes peering at them through their bedroom window. Lucky asked his mother to take the children into a room at the rear of the house.
It's like a
and
fucking
suggested
Pokemon.
that JC accompany them. A few minutes later, there was another scream, as one of the strange faces now appeared at the window in the back room. This was followed by another shot and the sound of breaking glass, as JC unloaded with his 20 gauge. Once again, the creature simply bounced backwards, unhurt, and scrambled out of sight. Over the course of the next 2 hours,
Yeah, they don't give a
the
shit.
family would be terrorized by these small entities. Scratching sounds would be heard on the roof, faces would appear at the windows, the family would look outside, only to see a number of them moving about the yard, or perched up in the trees near the house. Although the beings never tried to enter the residence itself, they seemed especially interested in the children, and each time they got too close for comfort, they would be shot at by either Lucky, Billy Ray, or JC. Between the three men, they estimated that there were probably 3 or 4 of the strange beings in total, at which they would fire more than 100 shots.
Damn.
At around 11:30 PM, there seemed to be a lull in activity. Thinking that maybe the creatures had left, the family piled into 2 trucks and drove to the police station in Hopkinsville.
Maybe they just
The desk
accidentally
sergeant on
shot up the
duty
house
didn't
and they had to
know
like
what
make up a
of their
story.
story, and at first reacted with mild amusement. Someone was pulling his chain, he thought to himself. Nevertheless, he had no choice but to take the matter seriously. In the back of his mind, he was at least half concerned that a gun battle might have taken place between local residents, and arranged for the immediate dispatch of officers to the scene.
'Cause that's what I would think.
In all, 4 city police, 5 state troopers, 3 deputy sheriffs, and 4 military police from nearby Fort Campbell arrived on the scene at the Sutton farmhouse. They found extensive damage to the property in the form of bullet holes, screen doors which had been peppered with gunfire, windows which had been blasted through, and shot which was found embedded in the frames of doors and windows. Littered around the home were various shell casings. It was quite evident that something significant had taken place, but a wider inspection of the property yielded little evidence.
It's the first battle
One
of
officer
planet
noticed
Earth.
something glowing in the distant trees, but a search of that area returned nothing. At a spot where Lucky had apparently shot one of the
But if they were
beings,
trying to make peaceful
officers
contact.
found a stain that gave off an odd sheen when viewed from a certain angle, but there was nothing really to collect or sample. It appeared the creatures, whatever they were, had left. The family were interviewed at length, and all gave the same consistent account of the night's events, as well as uncannily similar descriptions of the entities that had besieged the farmhouse. Neighbours also somewhat corroborated their story, saying they had seen strange lights in the woods, and assumed it was the Suttons looking for one of their
It could be
pigs
the
that had
moonshine.
escaped. Later they would also hear the gunfire, and reasoned at the time that they were perhaps trying to scare off a bobcat, which was worrying their livestock. Nevertheless, after hours of fruitless investigation, the officers felt they had exhausted their efforts and departed the scene. The next day, neighbours converged on the Sutton property, intrigued by the
Yeah,
rumours
Roy
which had
brought
been
back this
circulating
old
around town in
moonshine
the
that
aftermath of the
smelled a little
incident,
funny,
only
and
to find that no one was home.
when we woke up, we shot
As
the
it would
house up.
transpire, Glennie had awoken at 3:30 in the morning and had seen one of the creature's faces peering at her through the window. The strange beings had returned during the night, but had left again as soon as the first rays of sunlight had appeared on the horizon. The family and their guests had not been far behind. Terrified beyond belief, they had left in their trucks, and it would be some time before they returned home. Over the following months, a media circus ensued, Local as well as national publications, radio and TV stations all wanted to interview the Sutton family and their friends. At first, the Suttons were forthcoming, but as soon as the true agenda behind this interest was realised, one of ridicule and cynicism, they became introverted regarding what happened and refused to comment any further.
Well, you gotta understand how
Of the
ridiculous
lucky
that
few
sounds.
Who did manage to speak to members of the family in the months, years, and even decades
come on.
afterwards,
Little.
all would comment on how each of their stories remained
Wild.
ironclad, unchanged, and startlingly similar to each other's, despite the amount of time that had passed. After constant harassment from reporters and souvenir hunters, Glennie and her family vacated the property within a few months. But it wasn't just the barrage of unwanted callers that drove them away. It was the constant fear that those creatures, whatever they were, would one day return. Much has been written about the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter over the years, and it's safe to say that opinion remains well and truly divided over its legitimacy. Many of the police officers who attended the scene that night attested to the family's state of utter panic, along with the amount of damage caused to their property. They would go on to declare on record that they had no doubts whatsoever the family and their guests experienced something, but whether it had anything to do with extraterrestrials was another matter entirely. Skeptics have argued that it was a case of mistaken identity, perhaps agitated by excessive alcohol consumption. Joe Nichol, a member of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, theorised that what the family had actually seen were a mating pair of great horned owls. After all, these are fairly large nocturnal birds, which have yellow eyes, fly silently, and aggressively defend their territory. The descriptions of the creatures given by the family do somewhat loosely fit these characteristics, but there are a number of glaring issues.
Imagine that. It's like, oh, it
The
was
Suttons
owls.
described the entities as being around 3.5 feet in height,
Right, it was an
which is
owl.
significantly taller than the maximum height of the great horned owl. Secondly, these birds will almost always attack from higher up. They would not, and could not, hover slowly, just mere inches above the ground when zeroing in on a target. The final issue, and perhaps the most
It was like that
obvious,
metal
is that great horned
owl
owls
from
are not
fucking
bulletproof, and they certainly do not rattle like tin
Clash
cans
of the
when
Titans.
shot at. In light of this, skeptics then fall back on the possibility that the family were intoxicated, or simply fabricated the entire incident for financial gain. Police found no evidence whatsoever that the Suttons or their guests had been drinking alcohol on the night in question, and they also doubted that a relatively poor family would destroy their own property as part of a hoax. They never made any real money from their story, even though they had ample opportunity to, and the repair costs would have created an extra burden, which they simply did not need. However, there were accounts of people being charged a fee to enter the property in the wake of the incident, which the Suttons readily admitted to, and stated that it was their way of deterring unwanted visitors.
What? The charge
Whilst
then?
the story seems highly fantastical, so many of the family's friends, acquaintances and neighbours vouched for their integrity in the years following the encounter, stating that it would have been completely out of character for any of them to perpetuate a hoax of this magnitude. Not one of them sought the spotlight, and in fact, they shied away from fame and fortune altogether. They have always maintained that they were the reluctant victims of something they were never able to fully understand, and that the less they had to do with it, the better. As it would turn out, a little-known case which occurred in the spring of 2012 would seemingly corroborate the Suttons' tale, and leave the rest of us asking if the Kentucky Goblins had returned.
Had they returned? That's them goblins. Oh my god, this one's a half hour long. Alright, I'll do it. I did not plan on this being this long.
In the previous episode, we discussed the events that occurred at a farmhouse in rural Kentucky during the summer of 1955, in which an entire family was besieged by what they believed to be extraterrestrial beings.
Entire family.
It is a case that has resonated over the last 60 years. But what if the same thing happened to another family as recently as 2012?
Maybe they just made their home here, I guess, if they crash landed. What they wanted to do with their time.
Hello, my name is Dr. David Christie. I received your contact information through a mutual acquaintance who assures me that you are well equipped to investigate peculiar problems. Furthermore, I believe you may have interest in these events beyond any compensation that I am prepared to deliver in order to have these issues sorted. For the past 6 months, I have been living in a rural home located on the border of West Virginia and Kentucky, where my family is nightly assaulted by creatures that I have come to believe are of an extraterrestrial origin. These beings appear to be the size and stature of a small child, devoid of any facial features save for large, oily eyes and lipless mouths. They frighten my children by peering through their bedroom windows, chirping at one another. They actively attempt to enter my home in the middle of the night.
Yeah, I like the way this starts
Last
off
month,
with
we
him
took
just
my
reading the
dog.
letter. This letter is cool.
The police refused to provide any further assistance, attributing the problem to wild animals and forwarding my complaints to the State Game Commission. I believe they are coming from an abandoned mine located on the edge of my property. Though I'm armed, I'm afraid that I'm far too frightened to enter the mine by my lonesome, and cannot convince any sympathetic friends to accompany me, though I cannot blame them. I am convinced that the only answer is to collapse the mine. I believe this is where we can be mutually beneficial to one another. If you are prepared to assist me in this matter, I can offer you permission to record and document these events under the condition of anonymity. I can guarantee you evidence of these creatures which I assure you are not wild animals. Please respond ASAP. Thank you.
What you have just heard is the content of an email sent to paranormal investigator Greg Newkirk of weekinweird.com on the 22nd of April 2012. Originally thought to be nothing more than a simple prank or hoax, this initial communication would prove to be the spark that would ignite one of the most intriguing cases of recent times, one that would come back to haunt those involved again and again over the course of nearly a decade and counting. In all, Dr. David Christie would send 4 emails to Greg over the course of several months, before he seemingly disappeared from the face of the earth, never to be heard from again.
No, this channel's called Bedtime Stories.
In this episode, we will read the transcripts of
There's
those
just a different guy
emails
reading a letter. Yeah,
and show the
for
photographic
dramatic
materials
effect.
which appeared to back up the besieged doctor's claims. In his younger days, Greg used to run a rather tongue-in-cheek ghost hunting team known as Ghost Hunters Incorporated.
What?
It was to this group's website that the first of Dr. Christie's emails was sent. Ghost Hunters Inc. had long since disbanded, and the website hadn't been updated in years, but Greg would still monitor the site's server and check for messages from time to time, so it came as something of a surprise to him when he received this particular email, not least because it obviously had nothing to do with ghosts. Not being one to shy away from a challenge, Greg replied, extraterrestrials or explosives,
Audio died for a second.
but that he would be glad to assist if David could elaborate on the details or provide any evidence. After clicking the send button, he did not expect to receive a response. However, the next day, he found the following email sitting in his inbox.
Thank you for the prompt response. I do not blame you for being skeptical of my story. I appreciate you keeping an open mind about my situation, and I am more than happy to provide you with as much information as I am able. I was given your contact information through a man by the name of Terry Wrist. When these disturbances first began occurring, I was only inclined to confide in a personal friend who I knew had fringe interests. He offered to share my concerns with a man that had dealt with somewhat similar experiences in previous years. I accepted his offer. Within a week, I was informed that this gentleman had long since retired from pursuits of this kind, but was willing to provide me with contacts who may be willing to help. This is how I came to contact you. I do not have any answer to why, other than a referral and recommendation from a gentleman I do not know personally. I was under the impression that you would answer that question. I am located in Pike County, just outside the town of Hellier, Kentucky.
This guy,
Hellier is located
his voice
about
reminds me of
30 to
that
60
guy
minutes
from
the
Walking Dead
borders of Virginia and West Virginia, respectively.
with the mullet. I can't think of his name.
Most of Pike County is made up of small towns and rural communities. It is not uncommon to go days without seeing my closest neighbors. I moved to this area for the peace and quiet. I have received neither. I have lived in this area for just under 7 months, and in that time the majority of the harassment has occurred within the past 3. I did not become aware of any strangeness until early December, although that is only when I began to keep a record of these events. At first, it was merely strange tracks in the snow around my home. I had initially imagined that they were from some kind of animal, though it closely resembled a human footprint minus the heel. At that time, I was under the impression that it was simply a single creature. It wasn't until weeks later that I began to suspect that I was dealing with a number of what I thought were individuals hazing me upon my arrival to the area. At this point, I was incapable of keeping my dog outdoors overnight. Any attempt to leave her leashed would result in her barking herself hoarse until she was allowed back indoors. In the weeks leading up to this particular evening, I had awoken to find my shed doors open on several occasions, many of my children's toys missing or moved, and my yard in general disarray. I had already given a report to the police, who were making it increasingly clear that they were not interested in my case, barring physical harm or large-scale theft. The second week of January, I'm having breakfast with my family when my 5-year-old daughter begins talking about the kids without hair. When my wife inquired about these kids, she informed us that she had spent the previous night watching them play in the yard. As you can imagine, that was of some concern. I asked my daughter what these kids looked like. She told me that they were bald like Grandpa and weren't wearing any clothes. The very same day, I found the wreath that hangs inside our rear porch stuffed into our mailbox. I purchased and installed motion-activated floodlights the following day, and for a time, the problem ceased. It wasn't until the end of February that our daughter informed us that the bald kids had returned. I was awoken to the sound of my daughter screaming and rushed into her bedroom only to meet her halfway down the hall. When my wife and I were finally able to calm her down enough to speak, she told us that the kids were trying to peer into her window, but they couldn't reach, and instead had taken to tapping on it. She hasn't slept in her own bedroom since. It was that morning that I phoned the police for the second time, and they responded by finally sending a trooper to our residence. I informed him of the regular mischief, how I was unable to let my dog outdoors after dusk, and of the bald kids. When we found the ground disturbed just under my daughter's bedroom window, the officer informed me, very matter-of-factly, that we were dealing with an animal and I would be better off contacting the Game Commission than waste their resources any further. Almost every day for the following week, I would find some evidence that something or someone had been on my property the previous night. Smudges on the windows were not uncommon. Stones from the walkway dragged to the other side of the lawn, and I had found tears in the screen door. On Wednesday, the 7th of March, I finally witnessed the kids without hair for myself. The dog woke me up around 1:30 a.m., scratching at the back door and whimpering to be let out. I noticed that the motion floodlights was on, and went
Yeah,
to the
this guy's
kitchen
voice is
window
good for
to check
this.
that the shed
I do
doors
like
were
it.
still closed.
I'm just kind of like
When I
listening.
realized that I could see the shadow of an individual cast across my lawn.
Something about this kind of story is so good.
From the angle I was positioned, I could not actually see the source of the shadow or the floodlights. The dog was pacing circles around the back door, and I could hear someone rifling through a box on the porch. Filled with more anger than common sense, the only reaction I could muster was to bang loudly on the window and yell, at which point I heard the screen door on the
Different
porch
family.
swing open and slam against the house. I heard what I can
If you
only
meant from the
describe
other
as
video.
chirping at this point. It sounded much like a skunk, if more guttural. I then realized that there were more than 2 people on my property, and the shadow, which had been reacting as if it didn't know which way to run, was quickly joined by another. For a moment, I watched as the shadows chirped at one another when I noticed a figure out of the corner of my eye. Standing in the flower bed just to the bottom left of my window was a small humanoid figure with sickly pale skin. Completely hairless, standing roughly 4 foot. It was looking in the direction of the shadows, and had clearly come from around the left side of the house, opposite the porch, and had not noticed me as far as I could tell. Its face was devoid of features, save for large round eyes, very reminiscent in shape and color of a bird's eye. It had no nose to speak of, and only a small slit for a mouth. It didn't appear to move its mouth as it chirped, sounding more as if the noises originated from its throat. It was most certainly not a wild animal, and even more certainly not a child. I was too terrified to move, and watched as the creature hopped to the others, and together they scrambled into the woods on the right side of my property. It was clear that there were at least 5 in the group. I've not mentioned this particular incident to my wife, and the only other person who I've spoken to about these creatures are yourself and the close friend who introduced me to our mutual friend, Mr. Wrist. I would prefer to keep things that way, and to approach
what did he
this
call him,
problem as
Mr.
discreetly
Wrist?
as possible. Since that evening, my dog has gone missing from the porch, yet to return, and I can only imagine that this disappearance has to do with these creatures. I've gone looking for him during daylight hours, only to find many of my missing belongings scattered at the entrance to an abandoned mine shaft at the far edge of my property. I don't dare go inside. My friend has convinced me that my experience is similar to that of other visitation experiences, providing me with material and references that back up his claims. I am aware of the outlandish nature of what I have told you, but I'm afraid that I have no other explanation for what I have seen, at least at this time. I can see no other option than to seal the entrance to the mine. I cannot achieve this on my own, and I am too frightened to try. I don't dare share this information with others for fear of ruining my career and the reputation of my family. I am prepared to compensate your travel expenses and offer you unrestricted access with whatever recording equipment that you desire, but only on the condition of complete anonymity. Beyond that, I have no desire than to be rid of this problem. Please inform me of what you would like photographs of and where to send them. Thank you again.
Although Greg was intrigued by the doctor's story, he was not prepared to commit to an investigation without any supporting evidence.
Very
He responded
intriguing
by reiterating
story.
this request. But the thing that most stood out to the intrepid investigator was the name of the so-called mutual acquaintance, Terry Wrist. Greg had never heard of this person, and wondered whether it was someone he might have met only briefly during his past exploits.
Mr.
An
Wrist
online
sounds like
search
some like
garnered
really
no tangible
jacked
leads in
like
this direction, but it did reference something that
boss
seemed just
in a
little
video
too
game.
coincidental to
I don't know.
ignore. Terry Wrist was not a real name, but it does appear in 2 books by Alan H. Greenfield, titled The Secret Cipher of the Ufonauts and The Secret Rituals of the Men in Black. In each of these books, the author conducts an
That's kinda
interview with
weird.
an ex-military individual who uses Terry Wrist as a pseudonym. But it is what this individual talks about that is most interesting. In The Secret Cipher of the Ufonauts, Terry Rist claims that he was part of a covert group of Vietnam War veterans, which was tasked with infiltrating and destroying underground alien bases situated in the southern United States, the entrances of which were to be found in various caves or abandoned mines. As far-fetched as this appeared, Greg could not simply dismiss the obvious connection, though he understandably approached it with some skepticism, a skepticism which only grew when David failed to respond to his request for proof. However, as we shall see, the name of Terry Rist would crop up again in due course. In the meantime, the lack of any further emails from Dr. Christie was seen as suspicious, and just as Greg was beginning to write the whole thing off as a brief but intriguing hoax, another message appeared in his inbox.
My apologies for the time it has taken me to reply to your previous email. The situation at my home had become unbearable, and we chose to stay with my wife's family out of state until an appropriate solution can be reached. I am at my wit's end. This afternoon, my brother-in-law and I traveled back to the house for the first time in over a month, as I needed to check on the security of my property and gather some belongings. The house seems relatively untouched, leading me to believe that the creature's motives were driven by the presence of my family. As you requested, I brought a camera back to the property for the purpose of photographic evidence. While my home was free of tampering, I was able to find a trail of prints that matched the size and shape of those previously left by the creatures on my property. The prints lead into the woods behind my home, following a stream that runs near the mine. My brother-in-law, an avid sportsman, cannot identify the tracks despite his skepticism. Perhaps you know of someone better suited to identify these prints. I will be spending the next 2 nights in my home, and will send you more images should the opportunity present itself. I am looking forward to your thoughts.
Attached to this email was a series of photographs depicting a strange set of footprints left in the mud, which Greg did not recognize. He was not an outdoorsman, but still carried out his due diligence and sent the images to a number of people who were better qualified to identify them. No one had an answer as to what kind of animal could have made them. And what was interesting about these prints was that they exhibited dermal ridges. These are long, thin indentations created by the creases of skin on the bottom of a bare foot. They are considered amongst experts to be as unique as fingerprints and are extremely difficult to fake. The fact that they were present in these examples lent a degree of credence to the doctor's story, and finally attracted Greg's full and undivided attention.
Yeah, that looks
He
pretty
replied
weird.
instantly,
Just that
asking
fucking,
whether David
like,
could
root.
place something next to the footprints which would give them
Also,
a sense
yeah,
of
this is
scale.
a show. All this.
Sure enough, the next morning,
Hellier
another
is a
message
show,
was
I
waiting
think.
in his inbox,
Weird.
with even more attachments.
The creatures came out the woods late last evening.
Came
I
out
have
the
enclosed
woods.
photographs taken to the best of my ability given the situation. I have also enclosed photographs of the creature's footprints alongside a measuring stick. My brother-in-law is not as skeptical as he was when we arrived, and we will be leaving before dark this evening. I look forward to hearing back from you.
The first set of images showed more footprints, this time with a ruler placed beside them, and it was clear from the measurements that they were about half the length of a human footprint. Each one had the same 3-toed configuration, and they were all missing a heel, suggesting that whatever had made them either walked on its tiptoes or had very small feet.
They're
They were
missing
also clearly made
heels.
by a biped, as there was a distinct lack of any foreprints. As interesting as these images were, nothing could have prepared Greg for what he saw in the next few attachments. In total, there were 3 photographs of the so-called creatures, the first of which was thrown out as it didn't seem to show much. The second one was similar, but once the contrast levels were adjusted, it appeared to show what looked like a grey alien standing in profile, looking off to the left. The shape of a large head, as well as a dark eye,
Oh my
and orifice where
God.
the ear would be situated, could also be seen. The third and final image was a lot clearer, and
Windows
seemed to
error
depict a
sound,
humanoid
sorry.
creature of some kind, peeping out
Really
from behind
annoying.
a tree. Its head, neck and shoulder, as well as a portion of its left arm were visible even in the low light, but the results were far from conclusive. Whatever was captured in these photographs would unfortunately remain a mystery, as Greg never heard from Dr. David Christie again, despite repeated attempts to re-establish contact. Nevertheless, he was not about to give up on the case, and considered other ways of investigating the doctor's account. As David had mentioned that he'd called the police during these incidents, Greg surmised that there must have been a record of some sort, be it an incident report or call log, and set about contacting the authorities in that area. Helier itself was too small for a local police station, so he instead contacted the closest state police department. They could indeed confirm that they had received and investigated a call very similar to that described in the email, but would not divulge any further details. Next, Greg checked census records to see if anyone by the name of David Christie had ever lived in the town, but Helier's small size made this impossible, as no census data had ever been recorded. Finally, he wanted to know if there were any abandoned mines in the region, and after checking government records, found that there were in fact dozens within a relatively small area. Furthermore, quite a few properties had streams running through them, another factor which had been mentioned in the doctor's emails.
Streams.
All of these details seemed to correlate, but there just wasn't enough evidence to pinpoint an exact address, and David had never given any specifics in this regard. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months without any further contact from this man, Greg reluctantly shelved the case and decided to focus his attention elsewhere. During the latter half of the year, he and his wife Dana were heavily involved in the filming and production of Planet Weird's Engaging the Strange documentary web series. During their research and preparation for a particular experiment, which was to be carried out during that series, Greg and Dana had the chance to visit Brown Mountain in North Carolina. Brown Mountain, of course, plays host to the world-famous Brown Mountain Lights, which are frequently reported in the region. Completely unrelated to the case of Dr. Christie, one of the couple's friends and colleagues just happened to mention during filming that he knew of a nearby cave that was supposedly the entrance to an underground alien base, and asked them if they would like to see it. They of course agreed, and whilst Greg and Dana never found any entrances to alien bases, they did find a huge, out-of-place boulder, which did not seem analogous to its surroundings, and appeared to be blocking off a passageway which led into the further recesses of the cave. Although this was interesting, it wasn't exactly definitive, and would have been written off entirely as a light-hearted distraction from filming, had it not been for another email 5 months later, from none other than Terry Rist. On the 4th of February 2013, the following message appeared in Greg's inbox.
Why did you stop when you were so close? I have something for you. 1 week.
Greg immediately jumped to the conclusion that someone was messing around.
And that's a threat.
After all, he had made a public post about David Christie's emails and the connection to Terry Rist on weekinweird.com, but with most of the personal details redacted. But then, exactly a week later,
Is Week in Weird
another
still
email
a thing?
from Mr. Rist would put this suspicion to bed.
Hellier was just a symptom. The ink and black are isolated
Is.
still in the third order MIA. Bear in mind, for every door closed, a window must be open.
Is it just a way for
The
them
door
to
is
like
closed.
close their thing?
The window is open. Use the numbers.
Attached to this email was an image, which appeared to show an old piece of paper with a string of 16 numbers on it. The fact that the person who had sent this email had mentioned Hellier specifically immediately set alarm bells ringing. In all of his posts, Greg had never mentioned the name of the town. Only a handful of people knew this information, people who Greg trusted implicitly. But even this wasn't the most haunting thing about the message. At first, nobody understood the significance of the 16 numbers in the image. That was until one of Greg's friends suggested that they could be GPS coordinates. Entering them into Google Maps, Greg watched the globe spin as it zoomed into its target. and he immediately felt sick. It pointed directly to the location of the supposed entrance to the underground base, which he and his wife had visited 5 months earlier. Again, very few people had known about this. Only a handful of camera crew, along with Greg and Dana's colleague, had been with them at the time, and even these people did not know the specifics about the case in Hellier. How could this person have known so much? Whilst it's possible that all of the emails Greg received were sent by the same person, how would that person have known about his trip to Brown Mountain, and more specifically, the exact location he visited on a whim? Something about this communication just didn't add up. For good reason, Greg and his wife felt extremely unsettled by its potential connotations. There was indeed a lot more to this mystery than he first thought, and this would lead him to formulate his own theories regarding the events. The similarities between David's case and the Kentucky Goblins of 1955 are hard to ignore. Both of them took
I love
place
that they
in
call them
rural
goblins.
Kentucky.
It's maybe like the
Both
coolest
of them
thing about this
featured a
entire
family
case.
being terrorized by small humanoid creatures, although the more recent case occurred over a prolonged period, as opposed to the fleeting appearance made by the Kentucky Goblins. Greg questions whether these creatures could have been one and the same. Whilst there are a few notable differences between the two given descriptions, he suggests that these could be mechanical in nature rather than biological. For instance, what the Suttons thought were large ears on the so-called goblins might actually have been part of a helmet or headset, which could be removed. Kentucky itself is saturated with old coal mines and cave systems, as are many of the states in close proximity to the hills and mountains which run off the Appalachian Trail. Oddly enough, sightings of strange creatures resembling those seen in both these cases are not uncommon, and have given rise to a local legend alluding to the Little White Men of Kentucky.
I feel you. We're almost done.
One such sighting occurred in 1990. A 14-year-old boy named Donald Patton was playing on his family's property,
Not
situated
Donald.
in eastern Kentucky. He had spent the afternoon throwing rocks in the midst of a boulder field, located on a slight hill at the rear of the acreage.
Oh, they hate that.
There were also a couple of outbuildings nearby, and the land was surrounded by a wooden fence. Usually, his cousin Eric would have joined him, but on that day, he was there alone. At around 7 p.m, just as the sun was setting, Donald had sat down on a rock to take a rest when his father exited the house at the bottom of the slope and shouted, "You boys get back in here, it's getting late." Donald immediately started to walk down the hill towards the house, but his father continued to shout, "Eric, get down here." Confused by this, Donald queried why his dad was calling out to his cousin, explaining that he had been playing up on the hill alone. "Then who were the two people standing behind you?" his father had asked. Later on, he would tell his son that as he'd left the house, he had seen two small, strange-looking children standing right behind him. They were around 3.5 to 4 feet tall, and they were dressed completely in white. After he had called out, the two figures had immediately run off behind one of the outbuildings. "They were standing there, looking right down your shirt collar," he had told his son. With many other accounts involving
It's very
similar
spooky.
creatures, Greg wonders if the Kentucky Goblins incident of 1955
Almost
might
got
have been
him.
the beginning of this alleged phenomenon. He postulates that an extraterrestrial craft may have crashed here on Earth, and that its occupants then took refuge in the caves and abandoned mines that dot the Kentucky landscape, and that they still reside there to this day. What's interesting about this is that there was an abandoned mine not far from the Sutton residence. Could this have been where the so-called goblins disappeared to? There is also the theory that these creatures may have been
There's
here
just
for much
mines
longer,
everywhere there,
and may
though.
actually be terrestrial rather than
Caves, mines.
extraterrestrial. Elsewhere, in the southern states of the US, the Hopi Native American tribe spoke of the Ant People, a race of humanoid creatures who lived in huge caves underground.
Well, that seems like a
Their
pretty
drawings of these entities very
big
much
connection.
resemble the typical grey alien of UFO lore. So what are we to make of the email sent by Dr. David Christie? Was he genuinely a man besieged by these creatures, or was it all part of a clever hoax? Unfortunately, Much like the Kentucky Goblins case, as there is very little in the way of proof, opinion will remain divided.
Kentucky
Greg
Goblins.
never heard from him, or for that matter,
If
the
that's not the
person
name of
claiming
a
to be
sports
Terry
team in
Wrist ever
Kentucky,
again,
then someone's fucking
and it has
up.
been 4 years since the last communication referencing the case. In 2019, Planet Weird produced a 5-part documentary titled Hellier, which chronicled Greg and Dana's efforts to track down either the property where this apparently took place or
The
Dr. David
Kentucky
Christie
Fried
himself.
Goblins.
This documentary is available to watch on YouTube and is linked in the description.
That has to be like a
The
dessert
possibility
somewhere.
of the
That
whole
sounds
thing being
dank.
a hoax was very nearly confirmed during this series.
What would a Kentucky Fried
At one
Goblin be?
point, the investigative team realized that they might be able to find the doctor's physical address,
Like some kind of
by
sundae with a
tracking the
deep
IP
fried
linked
thing
to
in
his
it.
messages. Using this procedure, they discovered that the emails originated not from Hellier, Kentucky, as one might expect, but from Ajax in Ontario, Canada. However, it is quite possible, and even rather likely, that Dr. Christie was using a VPN, which would have masked his personal details. We must also point out a discrepancy in the messages themselves, and that is that Dr. Christie's dog seemed to change gender.
What?
In the second email, it was referred to early on as female, and then later, it had suddenly changed to male. However, David never quantifies exactly how many dogs he owns. It could be that he had more than one. When all is said and done, it is difficult to deny that the emails are intriguing, as well as the photographs that were sent along with them. They may
He just
or
like
may
forgot
not
that his
show
dog
inhuman creatures lurking
was a
in
dude,
the woods
I
after
guess.
dark in a backwater of Kentucky.
Yo, Sphinx.
But either way,
What's up,
they
everybody?
certainly work to fire the imagination.
We're literally just about to
leave us
wrap up,
asking,
but
what if? If there was such a person as David Christie,
hope you guys are
and if
well.
he truly
Thank you for
was
the raid.
terrorized by these beings, we can only hope that he was elsewhere able to find the peace and quiet for which he
You guys are
originally
doing
moved
well.
to Hellier. And if you ever go walking in the backwoods of Kentucky, make sure you stay away from any abandoned mines.
Like that picture makes it look creepier than it really was, but what the fuck is that sound effect? Those guys are crazy. That's the sound effect they went with. I really do like that story a lot. The Kentucky Goblins. But it does remind me of something hearing that sound at the very end. Yeah, just wrapping up. Thanks for the raid anyways, though. What's going on? Yeah, is it good? It reminds me of one thing that I saw. I guess yesterday. What the fuck was I watching this? You gotta check this shit out. Can you identify this sound just hearing it before I show you what it is? Yep, elephant seal. These fuckers are fucking in. I didn't even know they made that sound until the other day. This is them fighting. Like, are you fucking kidding me? This exists? The females are completely different looking. The females look like a different animal entirely. How did chat know that? Yeah, they're all parroting each other. No, I'm sure some people knew. I'm joking. Yeah, they look like Watto. They look like Gonzo. They look like a bunch of things. They just grab on the fat and rip the flesh. Yo, look at his eyes. He's like stoned. But yeah, that nose is insane. They just like make these noises. Yeah, you can tell, like, look at his fur or whatever. This happens a lot, obviously. Well, plus they get scuffed up on everything. Yeah, it looks like this place is like a ramp built for them. Like, look at that over there. Looks like he got his nose busted up. Yeah, they just beat each other up for a while. And this one bounces. Fucking out of here. There it goes. Yeah, that thing is wild. I don't know if this other video, if I can show this. It had like mad claims on it. Hold on. Which is fine, but sometimes I think this is fine. This one was crazy. So this is the female. Sounds like fucking Kremlin sounds from Donkey Kong Country. You hear that? Like, This is the female. It looks completely different. And it just makes those fucking farting sounds. Look at this fucking thing.
I don't think they taste good. They don't taste very good.
It looks like an alien.
Hi there. Hi, kitty.
Look at the fucking face on this thing. How does such a thing exist? It must be like a tour you pay to go on. Like some kind of little like... Like this is better than a fucking movie. The way that this... Imagine that. Like, it does not look real almost.
Sweetheart. Hello. Hello.
The fucking sound.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, then there's like the... That's the thing we saw fighting.
Yeah, I got it.
Tries eating the fucking tripod. Yeah, that thing is like, yo, let's get the fuck out of here. I got shit to do. Look at it. I love that these people are just all around everywhere, though. It's just like... There's penguins over there. A fucking legit
Hi.
goblin
Hi,
sounds.
both of yours. Yes, hi there. Hello. Yes.
There's like boats everywhere too. Like,
Yes.
then maybe that's like the main boat, and then the little boats come off of it and bring these guys out here.
Yes.
What if they like tried eating you? Yeah, look at those penguins. They're like moving. It looks like an animatronic monster. Like, it looks like you would see this at Chuck E. Cheese, like singing. That's what it looks like to me.
Oh yes, you're so beautiful. You're both so beautiful. Yes. Yes.
Look at it. It's awesome. It's just like, yeah.
I just think you're another seal. Yep. Well, that was pretty incredible.
Yep.
That video is pretty awesome. I like that one. Yeah, what does the description say? Landing at incredible St. Andrews Bay on a Cheeseman's Ecology Safaris expedition in October 2016. We were approached by two wieners, quote unquote, recently weaned elephant seal pups. So those were like young female pups, apparently. Where's St. Andrews Bay? Anyone know? Wieners. But they're those ones that look like that are female. Like, they don't look like fucking Gonzo from the Muppets, like the other one. Which is interesting.